For years and years there was only Mavitisinum, a god, and he was very lonely. He was the only individual on Earth, with no friends or companions. One day he decided to make a wife out of a beautiful shell that he found on the shore. This wife would bear him a son, and from this child all of mankind would come. As is with most Native American tribes, there is not much known about the Brazilian Aboriginals from before the Europeans came, just due to a lack of written records. There is archaeological evidence of a tribe named the Marajoara, who showed evidence of being able to support up to 100,000 people, and the presence of man-made dirt mounds shows evidence of a complex society. But this tribe was abandoned just before the Europeans came. There were many Native American tribes along the coast when the Portuguese, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, arrived, most of these tribes fighting amongst one another. The Portuguese made contact with many of these people on their first voyage, and named the lands that they found the Land of the True Cross, for religious purposes obviously. After 9 days, the Portuguese sailors returned home, but they left 2 prisoners there, who were supposed to be sentenced to death, to learn the native languages of the people. Over the next few years, the Portuguese didn't show much interest in the New World, the king only contracting a few expeditions for people to go and collect timber, known as Brazil wood. This wood made large quantities of easily accessible cheap red dye, so many European nations set their sights on the lands, but the Portuguese lined the coast with their warships to deter any European settlements. With this new fear of incursions on Portuguese claimed land, many settlers came, and the land was divided into 15 separate colonies. The Native Americans were not all too pleased with losing this land, obviously, so they were at constant war with the Europeans, trying to protect their homelands. But, over the century, over 90% of the native Brazilian population was decimated by disease and war. Each of the 15 separate small Portuguese colonies became more autonomous due to the decentralization of their governments, so they were united into the one great colony of Brazil under the leadership of the king. The first governor of the United Colony was Tomé de Sousa, who attempted to destroy all outside threats upon his colony by declaring war on all Native American tribes. This is because there was a French plan uncovered to ally with the Native Americans to oust the Portuguese from the New World. This reign of terror was interrupted by the king, who told de Sousa to stop killing the Native Americans and attempt to convert them into Christianity. But he did give him the best of both worlds, in allowing de Sousa to enslave them if they didn't convert. The French proved to be quite the thorn in the side of the Portuguese, as they built a fortress on an island just outside of Rio de Janeiro. This was swiftly dispatched, but the French did not give up, as they made a mainland colony named France Equinoxicale, yet, just as the first colony, the Portuguese made quick work of the French. The Dutch now intruded on the northeastern coast, and were successful in gaining a significant amount of territory, but since the local settlers were not fond of Dutch rule, and there were constant attacks from the Portuguese, the land was eventually retaken. Afro-Brazilian slaves were constantly in rebellion against their captors, some even escaping and forming a small state of freed peoples known as Palmares. Palmares was also constantly at war with Brazil. Eventually, the Portuguese offered peace. If Palmares submitted to Portuguese rule, then the former slaves would be able to keep their freedom. These people refused this, not wanting to live in a state where their brethren were still in chains. The Portuguese made quick work of Palmares. There was now a massive influx of settlers into Brazil. There was now a massive influx of settlers coming into Brazil with the discovery of gold. This came at a perfect timing, since sugar, the main export of the colony, began to lose value. It is estimated that about 1 million people came from both Portugal and Africa to mine gold. Now, in an attempt to make a fatal blow to the Portuguese in the War of Spanish Succession, the French captured Rio de Janeiro, and would only give it back once a ransom was paid. There was a short siege, but the Portuguese, seeing that they could not retake the city, paid the ransom, and the French went back home having looted the city. For a short time, Brazil became more than a colony and a part of mainland Portugal, when the king was living in Brazil and there was an outcry at home for a king to govern his country from his colony. So, to avoid anyone further, and not wanting to leave his exotic Brazil, he renamed his state the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This was short-lived, as the nobles of Europe resented this new status given to a mere colony, so the king reverted Brazil to its former title. Around this time, the Brazilian independence movement began to rise in popularity, which resulted in some revolts. The first of which, the Pernambucan Revolt, was destroyed before much could happen, as documents detailing their plans were found by the Portuguese. The demand for Brazilian independence continued, and the Portuguese Prince and Regent of Brazil, Dom Pedro, supported this movement. Because of this, his father, the King of Portugal, sent 2,000 troops to depose him from his position. But the prince had so much local support that around 10,000 armed Brazilians came to his aid. Pedro's father, very displeased with this, sent him a letter demanding he return home. But Pedro simply turned to his fellow Brazilians and said, "Friends, the Portuguese king wants to enslave and pursue us. From today our relations are broken. No ties can unite us anymore. For my blood, my honor, my God, I swear to give Brazil freedom." From that point forward, Brazil was independent, and Pedro hailed its constitutional emperor, although official independence wasn't achieved until a few months later, where the Empire of Brazil was born. The issue now was that Brazil was divided between the few independent states and the ones still under Portuguese control. The Brazilians scurried to create a standing army and deal with the unification. And despite being outclassed in their army and navy by the Portuguese, the Brazilians were successful in their goal. Following this, Pedro abandoned the Brazilians and returned home to Portugal when his father died in an attempt to claim the Portuguese throne. His son Pedro II was left in charge of Brazil, but as he was 5, a regency was implemented. With the lack of a charismatic ruler, there was a series of rebellions over 10 years, until Pedro II had an early coronation at the age of 15. One of the more important motions set forth by Pedro was the abolition of slavery in Brazil. The same year, Brazil entered a war against Argentina, who were trying to assert themselves over Uruguay. So, in an alliance between Brazil, 2 Argentinian breakaway states, and Uruguay, Brazil won the war, and undoubtedly asserted themselves as the greatest regional power. Later, Brazilians were upset that many raids were sent against their cattle farmers in the south, and there was a denial for Brazilians to cross the Uruguayan border. So, to not show weakness in front of such a weak opponent, the Brazilians invaded, with a covert alliance with an Uruguayan rebel group. As the plan to attack Uruguay was being hatched, the Paraguayans sent a letter to Brazil, stating that if Brazil invaded Uruguay, it would be disturbing the equilibrium of the states, and that Paraguay would invade in return. The Brazilians, not thinking that they were serious, attacked Uruguay anyways. In response, as they promised, the Paraguayans invaded. And since the Brazilian military was centralized in invading Uruguay, the Paraguayans found much success and territorial gains. After the Brazilians reached the Uruguayan capital, the Uruguayans capitulated, and the rebel faction entered office as the new government. This victory allowed for a united Uruguay and focused Brazil to turn their attention to defeating Paraguay. Then Argentina joined the alliance, since the Paraguayans declared war on them as well. But despite the superior numbers of the alliance, the Paraguayans had major victories at the beginning conflicts. This didn't discourage Brazil, and now they were on the offensive on the Paraguayan mainland. But due to a string of victories, the Brazilians got a little cocky, which led them to an Allied defeat that halted their offensive for nearly a year. Soon, the Allies regained steam and defeated the Paraguayans, and this led to a period of nearly uncontested regional power for Brazil, but not without its costs, as this would be the bloodiest war to ever hit the South American continent. Now the monarchy would be overthrown by the military, and the Empire of Brazil would become the Republic of the United States of Brazil. But this republic was a military dictatorship with rigged elections. This government greatly struggled because of economic turmoil and many revolts against them. This internal chaos led Brazil to stay neutral during World War I until near the end, when their merchant ships were repeatedly sunk by German U-boats. In response, civilians in outrage burned local German businesses. Most of the Brazilian war effort was in their anti-submarine campaign, since their soldiers were not trained in modern military tactics. At the Treaty of Versailles, Brazil was compensated by the German Empire for all of their merchant ships sunk, and Brazil was one of the founding members of the League of Nations. Following this was another military coup, this one led by Getúlio Vargas for another change in government. Many attempts were made by fascists, oligarchs, and communists to overthrow the suspectedly weak government, but none of these were successful. Argentina began segregating Brazil and South America, and Vargas, afraid of their superior army, began to pursue closer ties with the United States for protection. Once World War II started, the Brazilians took a more offensive strategy due to their close ties with the USA. They had trouble putting together a unit, but eventually they scrambled together the Smoking Cobras, which were designated to the American Army. And just like the last war, the Brazilians excelled navally. Around the time the war ended, there was another military coup that overthrew the government, but this time they actually instituted democracy. The country now saw an industrial boom, and built a new capital called Brasilia. But this short-lived republic was overthrown by another military coup, which led to another military dictatorship. And the slow turnover back to democracy didn't happen until some years later, with the first president of the Sixth Republic of Brazil. But corruption, poor management, hyperinflation, and police brutality plagued the country, so millions took to the streets in protest of their president, Rousseff, who was eventually impeached. The country was now proud to be hosting the Summer Olympics, but this brought along major controversy with it, since Brazil was in a major economic recession, and the games seemed to be unnecessary expenditures. The citizens of Brazil were sick of their treatment by the government, with scandal after scandal being brought forward, and extremely high murder and crime rates. The people wanted change, and they found it in an extremely right-wing politician, Bolsonaro. He, an extreme and openly racist, sexist, and homophobic man, led to a rise in neo-Nazism in Brazil. Many protests, mostly led by women and minorities, ensued during Bolsonaro's campaign and even after his inauguration. Yet, no extremist actions have been taken yet. Only the future can tell what's in store for Brazil now.